Queer Debut Authors panel. Thank you all so much for joining us here on this Sunday morning or whatever time it is for all of you. I figure we can all go around and introduce ourselves and then go around again and introduce our books and then chat for a while. Who wants to start?
Absolutely. I can start. My name is Patrick Earl Ryan. I am from New Orleans originally, and I live in San Francisco. So that's me. Who's next?
I can go next. Hello, my name is Michael Dumlao. I was born in Manila, Philippines. I grew up in Sydney, Australia. I went to high school in Santa Barbara, California, and I've resided in Washington, D.C. for the past 20 years.
Hey, I am Steven Salvatore, they, them, or he, him. I live in New York. I'm a college English composition professor. Right now, I'm just a shit poster on Twitter, but you know, and I write some books, which we'll talk about in a second.
I'm Anya, they, them pronouns, please. I grew up in North Carolina, moved to New York for college when I was 18 and never want to leave. I'm currently a social work grad student, hoping to become a therapist. And I'm also a writer, and I'm also a theater person. I mostly direct. And now I will talk about my book, and then everybody else can talk about their books. So I recently published Queen of All, which is my debut novel. It came out on June 8th. Here it is. This is what it looks like. Imagine if it was flipped the other way so that you could actually read the cover. It's a young adult fantasy novel. The first in a planned trilogy, and it is one of the first YA epic fantasy novels to have a lesbian protagonist. And a little bit more about that. I'll talk a little bit more about my specific journey to publication, but the thing to know about me and my book is that I started writing it when I was 12 years old. And so it is like a 15-year journey to publication, and this book has really grown up with me in a lot of ways, and I'm super excited that it's out in the world. And also it's like so weird, just very, very weird. So
we're gonna talk about how weird it is to be a debut, right?
Yeah, I think that's
and a debut in a pandemic.
I think that's going to be probably the main topic, is how weird it is to be that I don't know, other people walk into bookstores and buy my book. And I'm like, are you allowed to do that? Like, I know that's specifically what I wanted you to do, but would it be possible for people to like read and enjoy my book without perceiving it or knowing that I exist? Could that be arranged somehow? The answer is no. Does anyone have a book that they want to talk about?
I guess I'll go next. Again, my name is Patrick Earl Ryan, and the book.
Patrick,
book
I think you're muted.
Am I?
Maybe.
No, I can hear Patrick.
Oh, I can hear him.
Oh, okay. There we go. Facebook Live. Welcome. So this is my book. It's If We Were Electric, which is a short story collection. It won the Flannery O'Connor Award for short fiction, which comes out of the University of Georgia. It's a collection of stories that basically all take place in New Orleans, where I grew up. The interesting thing for me as a debut writer or a debut author is that I'm actually 51 years old. So it's been a long journey. These stories actually started when I was in my early 20s, and kind of it's through my 30s as well. I worked on them into my early 40s. And then I stopped writing for a while and put everything aside and said, screw writing. I was just tired of it. I wasn't getting any success. And then I picked it up again and decided to send it to an award, the first award I sent, and it won. And so I am back in the scene suddenly at 51 years old. And who knew that when I finally get published after all these years, it would be during the pandemic. So that's going to be an interesting topic for us, I think, to talk about. The stories themselves, they cover a lot of ground. I do kind of fall within Southern Gothic with a lot of my work. So a lot of dark themes throughout, a lot of sex, a lot of weirdness, Anyway, if you haven't read it, I hope you can read all of our books at some point. So they're all available, and we have websites that will come up for you guys later so that you can find information about us too. Who's next?
I can go next. So my book is actually it's going to be publishing in the week of August 30th. So I don't have a book to show, and I had actually intended to print my book cover out on a big piece of foam core, but then when I got it back from Kinko's, it was like massive because I misjudged the size. So I don't have it with me because I couldn't fit it into my suitcase. But if you can see it, that's my book cover. Hopefully you can see that. My book is called The Wisdom of Guncles. It's a collection of 11 short stories about gay uncles and queer mentors, really the relationship between queer people and our families, however we choose to define it, either biological or logical. And it's really about, these really, really interesting, very diverse, I prefaced as a queer person of color myself and an immigrant twice over. I focused a lot on immigrant stories, on stories about surviving, particularly socio-political economic trauma and escaping. Many of my cast members or my characters, which are all based off of real life people from all around the world, escape political turmoil to become pioneers, to become explorers, to become these people who really had to go through journeys, both physical, personal, and all forms of uncovering who they are as people, and really thinking through how that very queer, unapologetically queer journey can actually yield wisdoms, insights, and ways really of being that we then want to impart on our nieces, nephews, what I call nibblings, which is what I see as the gender neutral term for nieces and nephews, as well as goddaughters and younger proteges. And for me, this book, I think similar to Anya, it's a book that I've been basically writing since I was also a kid. One of the core tenets of the book is this idea of celebrating and elevating the black sheep of the family as the black/rainbow sheep of my family. I was the one who, like many people in my book, I had to leave a small town, come all the way to the big city to find safety, to discover my identity. And in becoming that black sheep, I also became a beacon for other black sheep in the family. And what we realize is that, while black sheep have historically been, discarded or shunned or erased, from the family tree, in many ways, those of us who are the black sheep are the instigators of progress. We're the disruptors and the defiers of tradition, and we define new traditions. And what I hope is going to make these very unapologetically queer stories universal is that at the end of the day, there's a little black sheep in all of us, especially those of us who see ourselves as entrepreneurs and innovators. And I really hope that these quintessentially queer narratives and queer experiences can serve as guideposts and hopefully, models, for anyone out there, however they identify, to figure out how they can find their place in the world and value what makes them different. All around these ideas of like elevating the black sheep, elevating these really unique stories, and just really anchoring this on this idea of what family means and how family in and of itself has evolved. And hopefully extending that towards building communities and building safe spaces so that we can all, feel safe essentially to grow into who we are as people. It's filled with trauma. It's filled with lots of different ways that people, sort of overcome, overcome what they have to overcome in their journeys. But it's also filled with a lot of triumph. So for me, it's, that dynamic of trauma and triumph and really still figuring yourself out and understanding that one's journey to personhood is never complete, it's never final, but it's filled with all these beautifully, very, very human moments that are very universal at the same time.
Beautifully said.
I love that. I love the concept of trauma and triumph because I personally think that they go hand in hand. I feel like you can't really have triumph without trauma, or you can't have joy without pain, because how would you know what joy feels like if you didn't know? And also vice versa. And with that said, can't take that away, is trauma and triumph. It's pain and joy. It's, all of those things that you were talking about. So my debut, Can't Take That Away, published from Bloomsbury in March 9th. of this past year. And it is about genderqueer teen Carrie Parker, who is a little bit lost. They came out way before the story starts. So they're out to everybody, their family knows, it's really just their mom and grandmother and their friends. And the school is more or less accepting, except for one particular tormentor and one truly awful queerphobic teacher. Carrie is an amazing singer, and their goal is to be like their hero Mariah Carey. They want to be a diva. They want to be on stage in the spotlight, singing a pop ballad on stage at Madison Square Garden. But something's holding them back. So they get up the courage to audition for the lead role of Elphaba in their high school production of Wicked. They land the role, spoiler alert, which is not really a spoiler because it's on the flat copy. But they face backlash from that one bully and that one queerphobic teacher. And they are then kicked out of the musical. And so they have to rally their friends together in protest. And they protest the school administration. And, there's baked into that, again, a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, a lot of what I have personally experienced. But, ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that it's very hopeful. And that's what I hope that readers take away from Carrie's experience, especially because, Carrie, and can't take that away, it's really the first YA novel with a genderqueer main character. There have been a few with genderqueer side characters, and there have been a few with non-binary main characters, and obviously a few with trans main characters, but none specifically with a genderqueer main character. So that's also been sort of an interesting road to navigate during debut year, just because sometimes people don't know what to make of my story. Is it a trans story? Is it a non-binary story? Is it a cis story? Is it somewhere in between? And my answer is somewhere in between. So, yeah.
That can be so unsettling, I think, for some people that they want things to be categorized, especially in the industry itself, as far as, how to sell something. And it's problematic, to say the least.
I think at some point we're going to talk about our debut journeys, and I can just tell you right now, my biggest struggle right now is categorizations. So I'd love if we could delve into that a bit, because that is such a fascinating part of this journey that I don't think any of us really anticipated would be a thing, especially since I think many of us live lives that try to defy categorizations, but the publishing industry wants you to be in one.
But how, and I'm sure, I don't want to speak for everybody's publishing experience, but, just publishing in general seems to cater to a cis, white, straight audience. And it's like, if you don't fit neatly into some box for the cis, straight, white, oftentimes female audience, where do you lie? And then because it's all about marketing, apparently, right? We have to know how to sell your book, but if we can't sell it as X or Y, we can't sell it as some sort of XY hybrid, because that doesn't exist yet. Why? Yeah. I don't understand why that can't exist.
I think, before we dive in, I think we should probably just dive into this strain of conversation, because it's a very rich one. I just wanted to say, to our audience, if anybody has questions that they want us to address at any point in the conversation, feel free to just drop them in the Facebook comments, and they'll be brought to us here on Zoom, and we can make time to talk about anything y'all want to talk about. And I'm also going to take this moment to slide in my thoughts on this issue, because I think it's so complicated, because I think we probably all know that in real life, whether our own personal queer identities are static or whether they change a lot, most people don't like have one identity category where they're like, oh, I'm this letter in the LGBTQ acronym, and that's all I'm ever going to be, and I'm going to stay there forever and ever, and it's going to be really, really cool and easy. Like, I sold my book as an Own Voices lesbian fantasy novel, and like, I have very complicated feelings about doing that because it feels weird to market my own identity as like a sales pitch, and it's also like, you know, sometimes I use the word, at certain points in my life, I've used the word lesbian to describe myself. At other times, I haven't. I've had romantic relationships with men and women in the past. Sometimes I've used bisexual or queer to identify myself. I realized I was non-binary literally during the pandemic, during the process of publishing this book. Now I'm confused again. Like, it's an ever-changing process, especially for me because I'm like, pretty young, and I was very young when I started writing this book, that like, but I'm putting myself out there in these interviews and in the marketing for my book as like, I am a lesbian and this is my lesbian book about a lesbian. And like, I think that's really important because I do want readers who are women-loving women to be able to find this book, because there is such a shortage, especially within YA genre fiction. And I also know that like, I wrote the book because like that was something I was looking for, and I would read all of these books written to appeal to young women, teenage girls who didn't fit in, and they often would center on these like very intense female friendships that never went to the place that it always kind of felt like they were going in the story. And like, I wanted to do that, and I don't think it's necessarily like wrong to market the book that way. I'm happy if that helps it find readers, but there's also like a very cynical part of it that's like, it's collapsing like my own identity, my own relationship with my identity, which is complicated and changes a lot, so that it can be like a hashtag, so that it can like sell books, so that like someone else can make money. And so it can be on like the rainbow display shelf for Pride Month, because that helps move books. And that is a complicated way to feel, I think. And I don't know that there's a way around that. And I will say, I've been really fortunate with my publisher, because I think they've been like out of their way respectful to make sure that like they are marketing the book in a way that lines up with my identity and how I feel about that, which I know is not the experience that every queer debut author has. But even with a publisher who's going out of their way to make sure that like I'm comfortable, I'm being represented, it still feels complicated to hold up the book and be like, oh, these are the identity term hashtags that you can apply to this book to sell it, when like, I don't know, I just spent 5 minutes trying to describe what my identity is and I'm still not sure. And sometimes it changes day to day. And so I think that makes it really, really difficult. And I don't know if there will ever be a time that publishing is ready to kind of embrace that part of the queer experience.
And a large part of that, I think, has to do with the larger the publisher, especially, but that there are these predetermined paths for publicity, how they publicize a book, how they put the PR out there. And so that, to come with it from a very complicated place, a complicated identity, doesn't work for them, because they have these lists. Okay, well, if you're a gay writer, say like I am, then these are the people that we send this out to. If you're a straight writer, or if you're talking about this genre, then we send it to this place. Within genres too. And so it becomes problematic when, say, like I identify as a gay male, I'm 51, but my stories themselves are quite complicated as far as genre, so that I don't really write just gay fiction. There's a lot in my book that has nothing to do with that. They're all queer in some sense of the word, the outsider, the other. But then how do you market that? There's a whole section of community that's not getting anything about my book because they think they want to market it completely to gay fiction. And that then isolates everything else. So I think those predetermined paths it's a sort of sense of laziness in the publishing industry, that they don't want to veer outside of those clear lanes that they have now, when nothing is really that clear. It's problematic, and I don't, the same way that Anya was saying, I don't think that there's a clear way of getting out of this, because the publishing industry is so set in its ways. So yeah, it's complicated, certainly.
I'll say that how it's manifesting for me is my publishers having me think through what my Amazon categories are going to be. And if you've gone through that journey, I was just introduced to this as a debut author, in this last couple of months, and going down the rabbit hole of the very niche parts of what could be considered categories on things like Amazon, which at the end of the day is probably the world's biggest bookseller at this point. So you have to think through exactly where you're competitive or where your book sells. And it's interesting how when you start to dissect what your book is about and what your book can offer to the world, then you start to think differently about what your book is. Like, for example, at the end of the day, I would say that my book is a collection of short story memoirs from a queer perspective, but I also am very intersectional. I mean, at least a third are transgender or non-binary, at least half are immigrants, at least 2/3 are people of color, mostly from Black and brown experiences. And so there's so many different kinds of intersections that I can go into, and especially in the Amazon categories. But at the same time, I can also go into parenting. That was an interesting thing for us to explore. The self-help world, which is incredibly saturated, which I think in many ways, I think my book does serve as self-help sort of a space, because it does help people, through issues that they may be navigating. And then LGBTQ in and of itself is so segmented and niched as well that it's almost hard. And from what I understand, Amazon is very specific about what things you categorize your book as you go into and start setting up the account. So that has been a fascinating sort of way for me to think differently about how I categorize my book and think about my book, to think, okay, who do I want to be served by these stories and how will they find it? So it now becomes this weird calculus of search terms and search categories, and who do I want to find this book? Like, I want a parent of someone who may or may not be a queer child, right, to see my book, because I feel like it definitely, serve them as well. At the same time, I also want a young LGBTQ questioning person to also find my book, because it definitely searches that as well. So do I go YA and teen? Do I go parenting? Do I disregard LGBTQ altogether because that's too narrow when I go more broad? How does that work? And so that's been an interesting part of my categorization journey.
I think.
Yeah, sorry, Anya, I didn't mean to cut you off. No, I just talking about categories. That's such a weird thing, because I remember when my book started appearing on Amazon. And that, I mean, as an experience in general, just seeing the title and your name and no cover art, because there's no cover art yet, but it's you can pre-order this, it doesn't come out for another year, but hey, it's whatever. And I remember looking at the categories, and one of the categories that my book was which I guess I'm assuming, the team, my publishing team, my publisher did, because I didn't have any say in that. But one of the categories was racism. And I emailed my editor at the time. I've gone through a couple different editors. My editor at the time, my agent, and I was like, my book doesn't tackle racism. Why is it categorized under racism? I'm not writing from a queer POC point of view. There are characters of color in my story, but it's very much a white queer narrative, because that's the author that is writing this story, and I don't necessarily know if there's a direct correlation to this. And I know authors are not supposed to look at their reviews on certain websites that I will not mention. But I mean, we're all human. Come on now. And there were a couple of reviews that were this is very much a white queer narrative. And I just want to point to the picture of the author and the picture of Carrie on the cover. Yeah, it is. So I think there's a lot of, just the publishing experience that we don't necessarily have a hand in, that it's like, oh, well, this is a predetermined category and we can't take it off of Amazon, so that's just how my book is categorized. And I don't know what that direct correlation is, but that's something that I've had to experience where, it's like I don't want anybody to think that I'm co-opting any sort of experience, that's not my lived experience. But it's like I have no control over this. And so I don't know what any of, all of your experiences are, in terms of marketing and what that experience has been like. But it's like I don't have a hand in marketing either. There's a lot of there was a lot of marketing that sort of said that Can't Take That Away as like a fluffy story of like triumph, and sort of leaving out like some of the other like descriptors that all you have to do is open this part up and read this, and it says right there, homophobic actions of a teacher that sort of lead into in the main climax and point of the novel. So it's like things are getting lost in translation in terms of the marketing that authors don't have any say in. And it's like, I'm just having to sit back and hope things play out and try to drive the narrative myself online the best that I can, which is something that, when I sold my book, I wasn't out as genderqueer. I had gone through a couple of years of therapy and just like figuring out a lot of things, and including my identity, and like Anya's experience, like things change and things evolve all the time. And some days it feels a little bit, squicky. It's like a little bit in between. It's hard to define all the time. But I knew that I had to like publicly make some sort of statement with my 500 Twitter followers, as if that's going to make any sort of difference. But it's like, if I don't come out as genderqueer to the world, even though I'm not out to my family, even though I wasn't even out to my husband yet, I wrote this book as a way to like figure out and untangle a lot of, my identity. But it's like, I had to do that because I felt like I had to drive that narrative. Even though nobody's owed anybody's experience, nobody's owed anybody's identity. You don't have to define yourself for anybody. You don't even have to define yourself for yourself. But it's like, as queer people, it's like we're taught we have to fit in. I don't know. I have many feelings, all the feelings.
So a lot of people said a lot of things that I am like super eager to respond to. I'm going to see if I can remember them all, get them all out. In terms of marketing, Steven, I had a really similar experience to you where I ended up in 2 Amazon categories through Amazon's algorithm, not through my publisher, is what I heard when I complained to my publisher about it, that were not appropriate for my book. One was, and it was different in the ebook and the paperback. Why? I couldn't tell you. The ebook, the #1 category it's in is lesbian romance, which is not like, okay, the main character is a lesbian, and she, like, I don't think this is a spoiler, she has a crush and it's unrequited. She's in love with her straight best friend. And I know that can be a painful topic, especially for like young queer people. And like, it's central to the book because it's central to the narrative, but also like, I think it's a pretty universal experience for like young queer people to, as you're starting to figure out your identity, you maybe have feelings for somebody who feels safe and comfortable to have those feelings for, in part because there's no way they can ever return them. I don't know, that was my experience, at least as a kid. And like, but that can be a really painful thing. And I don't want anybody to be reading this book being like, when is the romance gonna start? Because it's not. And so that's just a complete miscategorization. I think that's contributed to, I also am not supposed to read reviews, and sometimes I do. And sometimes I get in trouble with my therapist for that. But it's so hard. It's so hard. People who are disappointed that it's not a happier story. And I think we'll probably end up talking about that a little bit. That I think some of that is the expectation for romance that this Amazon tag is setting up. The other thing that the paperback ended up categorized is I was briefly #1 in Jewish literature and fiction, which was, I got a very unpleasant to read review based on that, because that is much more complicated. I'm Jewish, and I used a lot of Jewish influence in the world building. Was actually one of my goals, was that because this is second world epic fantasy, instead of the sort of vague medieval Christian world building that so many novels in that category have, I would use my family's Middle Eastern culture and Jewish religion and myth to build the world. But like, none of the characters are Jewish. Jews don't exist in this book. It's set in a fantasy world. And so I think people's feelings were hurt by that, and people were looking for something that wasn't there, that they were told by a marketing algorithm to look for. And now they're upset with me that it's not there. But I didn't tell them it was going to be there, because it was never there. And I think that, that's frustrating for me as a writer. I have to imagine it's also really frustrating for readers. And I think a big part of the pressure of this comes from like this pressure of being the first, or being one of a very, very small number of people in a category. Because like, I too get a lot of like, I wish that this book were happier. I wish that there were a romance in it. I wish there were a happy ending. I wish that there weren't homophobia. I wish that the character didn't have to come out. And like, I would love for, and also like different experiences of intersectionality that people are looking for that aren't in my book, because those aren't my experiences, or they're experiences that I didn't feel like I had time to address properly in this novel. If I weren't the only one, or one of a very small handful of people writing LGBTQ YA fantasy, I think people wouldn't be looking for something that it's not prepared to do, because they would be able to look elsewhere. But when you're the only one, or you're one of a really small handful, it's hard. It's hard to not let people down, because one book can't do everything. And I don't really think that people read like straight white books. I know this happens to straight authors of color too, but I don't think it happens to straight white authors, that people like read Stephen King novels and they're like, this was too scary. I wanted it to be happier. Like, they would go read a different book, right? But if young queer readers want to see themselves in a book, they don't have that many options. So maybe they'll pick up my book, even though it's not really what they're looking for, and then they're going to be disappointed. And I think that is an important conversation for us to have as authors for ourselves. I think it's also an important thing to say to readers when we get these questions, if they're addressed to us. I don't answer reviews. I'm at least doing that part right. That, yeah, it's true. My book couldn't do that. My book didn't intend to do that. I'm sorry it wasn't what you were looking for. I hope you got something out of it anyway. Please keep buying, reading, asking your library for, telling your friends about, tweeting, Instagramming, TikToking, whatever you do about queer literature, because then there will be more. And the more there is, the more you're going to find what you're looking for. And the last thing I wanted to say was just in response to the question of categorization, because something I found really hard is I feel like the marketing of my book, and this is on me at least as much as it's on my publisher, has been so heavily towards it's a queer fantasy novel that I've forgotten what else to say about this book. I mean, I even did it when I was introducing it for this panel, right? Like, I could talk about the plot, I could talk about the themes, but I haven't been encouraged to do that, and I haven't really remembered how else to talk about this as like a book that's worth people reading. And so I feel like it really ends up in this category, even though there's also there's a lot of other things that are really important to me about this book. And like, one thing that's really important to me is it's one of the first YA fantasy novels with a fat protagonist. And I think that is really important. But that's body diversity is a conversation that publishing is just barely the slightest, tiniest little bit, starting to barely kind of a little bit, not really have. And so that's not as good a way to sell a book. So we went with the LGBTQ angle. And I think that just feels really complicated. And as Michael, as you were saying, it feels like how do I make sure that then the right readers are hearing about this book if what's being said about it isn't what it is, especially because a book is a complicated thing and it could be a lot of things to a lot of different people, even some things that like I don't know about.
And so actually, just to riff off of that, to ask, and I do want to generally know everyone's opinion or experience through this, but, as queer writers who embody certain, very, very marginalized identities and voices that have not been heard in the, majority of literature out there, how have you contended with the responsibility and, dare I say, burden of representation? And also the idea of like, who is this for? Because I don't know about you, but like my publicist and my publishers, that's a daily, as well as a question in one of the, the questionnaires and even getting onto this panel is that, who is this for, right? Who is your audience? Who is your reader? And I think loaded in that, particularly with authors who embody marginalized identities, there's always that question of representation. And Anya, to your point, no one book can solve all problems, can address all issues. And dare I say, even though I very purposefully chose very, very diverse real life narratives in my book, I mean, I have people who embody disability. I have people who embody, lots of immigration stories and very multilingual, multinational, lots of POCs, lots of gender expression identities. But even then, in that diversity of stories, I know for a fact I am missing key identities because no one book can do everything. And so part of me has always been like, have I represented my communities properly and well, and what is their reception? And even beyond the question of have I represented myself? I mean, I think there's always, for any author, right? I mean, one of the basic rules, especially if you're a new author, is write what you know. So, one of the critiques that I've gotten is that I focused very purposefully on the dialectic of, trauma to triumph, right? And many, if not all of my characters have triumphed in some way, have arrived at a sense of success that they have defined for themselves. And I feel that that's really, really important, that they have defined what it means for them to come to a point where they feel that they're safe and they've achieved something. But then one of the critiques that I got from a very, very close friend and editor and reviewer of mine was that you didn't display what happens when they don't get to that point of triumph, when they sit in that trauma and they didn't get to that point. And I had to think to myself, be like, why did I choose the stories? Because all of us make choices, right? All creators and all creatives make choices of not only what to include, but also what to exclude. And I chose to exclude stories that didn't lead into some semblance of a queer perspective driven sort of idea of success or triumph, because that was very important to me. Because my audience, I ultimately wanted my audience to be my nieces and nephews and younger cousins who I am 41. I am also of an older age where I did not grow up with aspirational queer narratives. I only grew up, shortly after the AIDS pandemic, where literally if you were queer, you were going to die. And I do actually have stories of HIV and AIDS epidemic survivors in my book as well. But even I critically felt that I needed to see something that I didn't see as a young queer person. And that was that sort of triumph, sort of like that thing that, I chose to do that, right? I chose to do that. But then one of the critiques from one of my reviewers was, well, not all of us get to that point. Why didn't you represent the point where we're still sitting in it? And so it's that question of, representation. It's that question of like, I don't want to say that I represent all queer Filipino voices, in the world. But I also want to make sure that what I do represent is authentic to me, but also serves positively someone out there. And so that's been weighing on my mind a lot lately.
Michael, that's so interesting for me to hear, because I'm coming from the opposite, place. I think for me, from my experience with publishing, is that my book actually, there's trauma. It's seated in trauma, and specifically in domestic violence among men, in gay relationships or whoever. And a lot of the stories are about that. And so what I've gotten is the opposite. So like I had an agent for a while that I had to leave because he kept pushing me. Can't you write something with a happy ending? We need a happy ending. So that trauma to success was what they wanted, but I was letting them sit within that trauma, and that's it. And so that, I think, to a large degree, was something that they didn't find very tasty, and so pushing me in the opposite direction. So it's so interesting how how we can have these two perspectives and we both get flack for it, you know? It's like, what can we do? We can't do everything. So here, we have two books. They both do what you want. So get them both, you know? But speaking on the other thing is that what Anya was saying before is that there are certain parts of your book that get ignored. And that's one of the ones that really has been ignored, is that a large portion of my book has to do with trauma and about domestic violence. And so, you know, like that it's sad to me, because before the book came out, that was something that I really wanted to push forward. I really wanted to talk about it. I really wanted to get kind of, you know, dirty with it and talk about it, bring it out there, because you don't really hear about that. Even within nonfiction, you don't really read a lot about domestic abuse in relationships, in gay or queer relationships. And it's just been pushed down. It's not something that people have brought up in interviews that I've done, in readings that I've done. And a large portion of that, I think, this kind of ties everything back around to publicity, is that the experience that I've had with publicity is that the publicity that's going out for my book has all been written, you know, I was asked to reduce my book to 50 words. Give me 50 words about what this book is about. And what can you put into 50 words? But then every piece of publicity that has come out hasn't been by people who have read the book. It's only been by people who have read those 50 words. And so there's this huge gap, because nobody in the publicity departments actually picks up the book and reads it. It's only, you know, your editor, the one who's doing copy edits, things like that, who reads the book and actually gets into the details of what this book is about. But then in publicity, it's like they don't care about that. They want to see something in 50 words, and then they put it out there based on that. So it's disheartening that such a large portion of our books gets ignored simply because people aren't reading them before they put the publicity out there.
Yeah.
I think, sorry. It's so funny because, like, we all are writing vastly different types of books, yet experiences seem to be pretty shared. And it's like, regardless of who I speak with, you know, other queer authors, it seems to be very similar or you know, if not like exactly the same types of experiences. You know, I think, Michael, you had asked just about, you know, representation and like how you handle and sort of deal with that, and like the responsibility, I guess, that comes with that. So I wanted to touch upon that, because I thought it was really there's a lot that rests on an author's shoulder, and you know, we have a responsibility, but at the same time, we have a responsibility to readers, right? But we also have a responsibility to ourselves. Because I'm about to break the cardinal rule, right? And the rule is that, you know, especially as a young adult author, you write for kids. You write for someone other than yourself. I write for myself. I will tell anybody, I don't care. I write the stories that I want to write. And it's mostly me going through my own experiences and trying to process. That's how I process, in addition to actual paid therapy. But other than that, writing my stories and writing my experiences, that's how I've been able to process what I've been through, what I've gone through, all of that stuff. So I try to write as authentically as I can to me and to what I have gone through. And you know what the thing is? My experience as a gay, genderqueer person is not going to be the same as another gay, genderqueer person, is not going to be the same as another non-binary person. You know, I've had to sort of, one thing that I didn't quite anticipate, because when I was going through and sort of like figuring out my own and untangling my own identity, was that, no, I'm not trans. I'm not necessarily cis, but I know that I'm not trans. And when I wrote Carrie and Can't Take That Away, I didn't write it as a trans experience. but I get tagged as a trans writer, and Carrie, and Can't Take That Away, gets tagged as a trans book. And I don't want to take up space that doesn't belong to me. And I don't want to misrepresent myself or my book, and I never have. But that's a weird experience as a writer. Once the book is in somebody's hands, they get to interpret it however they want. If you read Carrie's experience and you think that they are trans, that's great. Maybe Carrie is. Maybe they just haven't figured it out yet because they're 17 years old. In the book, they make it very clear that they identify as genderqueer. That's who they are. And it's never contested. It's never talked about other than just, that brief explanation of what genderqueer means for Carrie. So I've had to do that as a writer, as like a public facing, like, am I Mariah Carey? I wish, but public facing individual, it's like, I have to sort of like define myself. So in terms of representation, I'm writing true to myself. As far as like sensitivity readers, I didn't get a sensitivity reader for genderqueer representation because I said, no, I'm not going to. This is my experience. If a genderqueer person doesn't like it, then that's totally fine. That's like going to a museum, seeing a painting and going, that's not for me. I don't really get it. I got sensitivity reads for everything else, but I didn't get a sensitivity read for genderqueer rep because I said, this is me. This is my experience. And I felt a big burden on my shoulders for that, but I also feel the need to be honest, with that, because it's part of this debut experience. And I think it's part of a greater necessary conversation. We can't write the one soul experience for our identities. We just have to hope, like Anya said, that more people can break through the gatekeepers and publish their stories so that there's a multitude of stories from which to choose.
This has been such a wonderful conversation. I wish that we could keep this Kiki going all day. We do only have about 10 minutes left. So I thought that I would kind of steer us. I know that like there's been a lot of conversation about a lot of barriers that queer writers face, even beyond that, like, there are practical barriers, there is real structural homophobia, there are publishers that are not willing to consider LGBTQ work, there are translation opportunities in foreign markets that we'll never get to have. But there are also all of these things about marketing and identity and the burden of like being the first one and thus the only one, and how to represent yourself and how to be what everybody needs, and all of these kind of like, I have found to be really challenging personally and professionally pressures that they get put on us as queer writers. And another thing I've noticed that we all have in common here is that we all decided to go ahead and do this anyway. And for many of us, it's been a really long experience. It's been many, many years of pushing to put this book out into the world and choosing to do it anyway. So I was wondering, just to close us off, if people have, like what got you through the process, what inspired you to keep pushing through for, in some cases, decades of work on this project, and what would you say to maybe young queer writers who are perhaps feeling like a little bit daunted by the prospect of facing this? Do you have advice or wisdom from your own experience to share?
I can start since I'm the oldest. And I see there's a question also from Genevieve, who talks about how do you incorporate diversity and representation in writing, even if you don't have direct lived experience. So I can speak a little bit to that. And that's that, first of all, what got me through, 30 years of waiting for this to happen was finally therapy. And I think we've all talked about therapy. And it was so important for me to be able to sit down and really talk with someone about this, because I went through a huge depression about writing in my career. And what it came to was just the understanding that every voice is valuable. We all have something to say. It's all valuable to put yourself out there. Otherwise, the people who might be out there who are like you will never hear you. And so there's a certain amount of bravery to step up and do that. Even if you don't see those people who might be like you, that your voice is actually important and that it's important for you to get it out there. And it's coming from that place, in regards to Genevieve's question, is just the idea that we have to speak from our own experiences. So if you come from a background where you don't have a huge amount of diversity among your friends and that sort of thing, then how can you write about that? So first, I think it's imperative that you kind of live the life that you want to live. Don't hold yourself back. And if there's no diversity within your life, then how can you write about diversity? So it's important that you actually find a way to write about who you are and not feel like there's this kind of, there's this rule that, you have to kind of incorporate all of these things into your own work. You can only write from your own perspective. That's what's going to be truth. And then if you write from truth, then people are going to respond to that. Whoever it is, it might not be a whole lot of people, and you have to get over that. I've gotten over that over the years, that, these dreams of being, the next Faulkner or the next, Eudora Welty or whatever it happens to be, you got to set that aside and be you. We can't be a carbon copy of somebody that we were inspired by or that we look up to. And I'll leave it there because I know we're running out of time.
I can go next since I think I'm the next oldest. I think we're going by age at this point. Also, my book is literally called The Wisdom of Guncles. So if I don't have wisdom to share, then why am I writing this book? So just to start with the question of representation. So when I first started my book, I originally literally pitched it as a Urban Outfitters style coffee table book with really chic illustrations of gay men holding up martini glasses going, "You got this, girl." And then I realized, and it was going to be basically just me, just talking about my experiences and the wisdoms I would give to my nieces, particularly, and my nephews. And then I realized that for me to have a book of value, I couldn't just speak from my own experience. So I did reach out, and I'm very grateful for the fact that I have built a life where I am surrounded by immensely diverse, incredibly interesting people. So I reached out to them. I actually reached out to more than 20, and I curated it down to the 10 that are in the book. And I wrote from their experience, and then that's why I call it that they're short story biographies and memoirs of their own experiences. And so I purposefully chose, the people I chose because of the diverse lived experiences and narratives and perspectives that they embody. And I tell their story, in sort of like my own way of telling their story, but it is very much their story. So one way to do it is, explore the creative nonfiction route of purposefully telling other people's stories in that sort of format. And I found that was a great way for me to create a book that went from sassy bon mots to conversations about really true lived experience where the wisdom is anchored in credible life experiences. And that's how I got to that question of how do I create something that does have a level of diversity that may not necessarily be my lived experience. So I brought other people's lived experiences and represented it for them. With regards to just the overall other question. Sorry, what was the other question? I am so sorry. I was just so focused on that one.
The other question was just sort of generally what got you through this process? What kept you going? And what kind of wisdom do you have for people who are facing up to a tough and often subtly queerphobic in many different ways road to publishing ahead? Right.
So what was interesting for me was one of my biggest concerns is that my editors were not going to understand my experience and therefore not understand my writing. And I was really, really lucky that I actually ended up I had 4 or 5 editors throughout the process. And at least half of them identified as queer, genderqueer, or also gender, they were basically very similar to me. Several of them absolutely had a very similar lived experiences. We all cried during a lot of our meetings because we were reflecting on how much of this was a shared experience for both of us. And so there was a level of trust there. And so I just want to offer that as maybe one example of how there are queer editors out there. There are genderqueer editors out there. There are people that do understand you. So it's not entirely impossible. You can find that, and they do exist. And I was so incredibly fortunate and privileged and lucky to have had those people share their experiences with me. And overall, in general, I feel like it's if anything, it's been a challenge for me just to figure out exactly where my people are in the industry. I did find them, and I'm continuing to find them. I found them here, right? I found them in OutWrite. I found them, and what I discovered throughout this journey is that you do have to be a bit intentional. You do have to scour. You have to find. You have to search. But when you search, it is a beautiful community out there. So if I can offer any bit of hope, it's that we exist. The community exists. There are amazing pockets of support there. There are the fellow authors here on this, and all the authors in OutWrite. Find them, reach out to them, reach out to all of us, because we will absolutely respond. I found, queer authors to be really, really responsive, because I think we all want to uplift each other, and I found that to be very, very helpful.
Yeah, I totally second, third that exactly. As far as the representation question, I think the first question you want to ask yourself is, what point of view are you writing from? If you are a white author and you want to write from a Black point of view, I think you need to ask yourself why you want to write from that point of view. Is that your story to tell? If you are a white writer and you want to have characters of color in your story, that's totally different. And what you can do to make sure that it is as authentic as possible is get sensitivity readers, get beta readers, make sure that you are doing your due diligence and writing as respectfully as possible. But definitely writing in first person, going outside of your lived experience, that's all I'm going to say. As far as what got me through this journey and this experience, finding my people. One of my closest friends I met on my writing journey, and he and I share everything and personal milestones, not professional writing stuff, but we speak every day, all day long about everything. And we have that additional support of sharing our writing with each other and sharing the certain milestones of the publishing journey with each other. So that's been really helpful. And then connecting with other authors. Even having experiences like this, where you're talking with other writers, maybe not broadcast on Facebook, but privately, but also broadcasting on Facebook in a forum like this, where it's you can commiserate and you can say wow, I was not alone. Maybe I felt alone at the time, but we all had these sort of shared experiences. So you find your people and you hold tight to them and you meet more and you just connect.
I'll try to close this out relatively briefly. To answer Genevieve your question, I get this question actually in almost every panel I've ever done. And I think that's very interesting because you do have direct lived experience to draw on. I don't know who you are. I don't know anything about you except your name and this question, but you have a set of lived experiences and they are different than everyone else's set of lived experiences. And you can draw from that and you will be representing a real lived experience. It'll be yours. And I want to second what Steven and others have said about if there's a specific kind of diversity and representation you want to incorporate in your book, really ask yourself why. I think generally the rule of thumb that I would use is that if you're going to write a character who has an identity that you don't share, that is totally fine. You should try to do so really responsibly and respectfully. Do your research, get sensitivity readers, compensate them fairly, which your publisher should do if you have one. But if they don't, then do it yourself. I did. And that's great, but don't try to write about the experiences of having an identity that you don't have. So for example, I'll speak about my own book. The sort of love interest secondary protagonist is a Black woman. And it was really important to me to have characters of many different races in the book because I know that is a serious problem in fantasy and I wanted everybody to get to feel represented by this book. The book is not at all about racism. I actually don't really touch on it or address it. And I certainly don't speak about a Black woman's lived experience of what racism would be like. because how would I do that in a respectful and responsible way? That's not my story to tell. And there's really no amount of research I could do that would ever close that gap, I think. And then the other thing, this is just a little tip, is that I also like to kind of ask, just ask around, ask friends, ask fellow writers, not to put the burden of emotional labor on your friends, but for people who are willing to have these conversations with you, I always like to ask people where the red flags for representation are, because this is on my mind. I'm having auditions for a play that I'm directing right now. And I ask every actor who comes through the door, what are the parts that you're super tired of playing? Because typecasting in theater is so real, just like stereotyping in writing. And I know what stereotypes I got, right? Like when I used to act, I'm like a fat AFAB person with large breasts. So they're always like, oh, you are a nurse or perhaps a slutty barmaid. And like, I was so sick of that. And I wanted more than anything to get to play like a romantic lead. But like all of this skinny, pretty white women out there are really tired of playing romantic leads, and they want to play someone like mean and conniving. And so like, those are different experiences, and I can't know from looking at somebody where their experiences are. I would say the same thing about writing different kinds of characters. Like I was writing a book with where one of the like magical characters is described as having what would be typically like East Asian features, and a friend of mine who's Chinese told me like, I feel like it's kind of weird to have the magical characters be Asian. That seems like it's getting into these like tropes of Orientalism and magic. And like, I never would have thought of that. I wouldn't have known that. And so that's one place to start. And just to kind of close things out, I would say, as far as what got me through, like Steven, like I write for myself. I don't know. I guess we're supposed to write for other people, but I don't. I don't like other people enough to do something for them for 15 years. Sorry. I write for this younger version of myself. And Patrick, as you were saying, like, you got to let go of the idea that your book is going to be for everybody, because no good work of art is for everybody. It's like a painting. If you don't like it, you don't like it. Somebody said that. I'm stealing that metaphor. And it can't be for everybody. If it's not for somebody, I have to kind of make my peace with that. And I actually technical tip, I went with a small press. That's been a great experience as a queer writer, because really the trade-off for me was like, do I want this book to be in every bookstore in the country, maybe someday, that anybody would be able to find it, and they probably won't? Or do I want it to be out in the world so that maybe somebody who really needs it will stumble across it and it will be there for them the way it wasn't there for me, right? Because like when I was 14, it wasn't there. It didn't exist. And I was looking for it so hard and I never found it. So like that was what kept me going for a decade and a half of writing this book and trying to get it published, was like, I wanted to give this book back to my younger self who didn't have it. And I think that kept me going. And I think that is a good enough reason to keep going, along with, community with other writers. I'll stop talking now because I know we've run a little bit over time, and I want to be respectful of everybody who's here listening, and just thank you so much to fellow panelists. It's been so nice to meet you all and chat with all of you. And thank you so much to everybody who joined us for this conversation.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you guys.
Mwah.
Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Yes, and I hope you all got something out of this.
And buy our books.
Yes, please buy all of our books. Yes.
Yeah, buy our books. Thank you.
Links are in the comments. Buy them all.
Right now, go.
Bye, guys.